Is there a difference between pure consciousness and utter void? As soon as you hint at something, perhaps the absolute or pure consciousness, it automatically triggers questions, doesn't it? So if you talk about pure consciousness and there's a philosophy of voidness, you might start thinking, well, what's the connection between the two? Are they the same? The thing is not to bother with the question in the first place, but to look in the sense of inquiry, in the sense of direct observation. And this observation isn't with the eyes, it's with awareness. Self-inquiry is really direct awareness. So even if there is, it isn't possible to put it into words. So we can't actually answer certain questions. Again, there's nothing particularly unusual in this, or even particularly mystical. If you were asked to explain the colour red, there's lots of ways you can go about it, but none of them would actually convey the experience of seeing the colour red. We cannot actually convey anything with words. All we can do is trigger supposed responses, or to trigger assumed responses by the use of words. So for example, if I say monkey to you, then this might very well trigger an image of a monkey. It might be a completely different monkey in your mind to the one in my mind. But there's a certain pattern of behaviours assumed, a certain context that might be assumed. So there are certain points of reference which are triggered by the use of words. But experience is not conveyed by words. So there's nothing mystical about this. We just have an overinflated opinion of what can be achieved by the use of words. But the reality is, we don't really buy into that opinion most of the time. If we're listening to instrumental music, words are completely redundant. So in practice, we're not that bothered about the power of words. It's only when we're actually using words that we start giving them a lot of importance. That's the words themselves, pulling us in, sucking us in. So just about everything is actually impossible to put into words, unless you've got some shared experience or common experience which we can relate to, and use words as a shorthand for these experiences. I am the pure consciousness if the notion of self-limitation ceases. So it says in the parenthesis, I am the pure space of consciousness if the notion of self-limitation, mental conditioning, ceases. Well, this is what you realize when you're no longer in the thrall of your mental conditioning, which brings us to identify with limiting notions of consciousness. Hence, since such limitation is but a notion, it cannot limit the infinite. When this understanding arises in one, though there is self-awareness, even that ceases, for there is no division between the observer and the observed. It is as if void is the ultimate truth. Void means you can't really say anything about it. I suppose this is answering the question at the beginning of the paragraph. Is there a difference between pure consciousness and utter void? And it's saying here, it's as if void is the ultimate truth, but it doesn't matter. Ignorance points to the hidden wisdom. Wisdom then destroys that ignorance and eventually that too comes to rest. That is the supreme state. Ignorance points to the hidden wisdom. Well, we'd have thought that ignorance, by definition, takes us away from the hidden wisdom. But as I mentioned earlier in this chapter, ignorance is actually the drive to understanding. Ignorance is actually intellectuality. Ignorance is the belief that intellectual understanding will be ultimately satisfactory. This is ignorance. But the drive behind it, the drive for understanding, is what will ultimately lead us to wisdom if we can see the limiting nature of our intellectual understanding. If we get in touch with that drive to understanding, that drive to make things fit, the drive to comprehend, if we carry on with that, we will ultimately go beyond intellectualism to realization. Realization is what we're really looking for. And for a long time we might believe that that realization can be expressed in ideas, in notions, in concepts, in intellectuality. Real philosophy must ultimately result in spirituality. If it doesn't, you're stuck. You're stuck with your notions and quite happy to just play with your notions. But if you really are wanting to pursue understanding, it must ultimately take you beyond your intellectual understanding. So this is proper ignorance. Ignorance which is properly pursued to its ultimate will eventually point to the hidden wisdom. It's not actually hidden, it's just so subtle that it's constantly overlooked. The wise Muni, one who is inwardly silent, becomes a manava, man, by self-knowledge. Or man becomes Muni. Being ignorant, the ignorant become animals and trees. The wise Muni, Muni is the sage, the silent one, the one who is inwardly silent. Some people take this as being outwardly silent as well, but that's missing the point somewhat. Shakyamuni was the name of the Buddha, which means the sage of the Shakya clan. And the Buddha certainly wasn't silent, he preached most of his life, but inwardly he was silent. The wise Muni becomes a manava, a man by self-knowledge. This word manava is translated in parentheses as man with a capital M. Perhaps it relates to Manu, the lawgiver. In which case the one who's realised self-knowledge is the source of wisdom and can be resorted to as such. But it says in parentheses, or man becomes Muni. Perhaps if you are one that lays down the law, then you will become a silent one, a silent sage. And then we've got this statement, being ignorant, the ignorant become animals and trees. And this is the externalization of ignorance. It's a kind of stuck state. It's not going anywhere. So animals and trees can be understood here as limited aspects of our own nature. We've got certain immobile aspects, and we've got aspects which give rise to our animal concerns. I am Brahman, and this is the world, are deluded notions.